Hello, Happy New Year. And on behalf of Megan and I'd love to welcome you all to the first ever Simply Smarter webinar of 2026. This, I think, is season 8 now. So we've done like 7 complete seasons and starting an eighth one, which feels crazy to me since I can remember when we did this for the first time. Um, but just before we started this webinar, we were having this fun conversation about like when to stop saying Happy New Year. And Megan, you had like a fun tidbit from Larry David that I think a lot of our crowd would love to hear.
Yeah, there's a little quote, I guess, from if any Curb Your Enthusiasm fans are out there, about when you can stop or when you should stop saying Happy New Year. So Larry David, right, always had opinions about the most mundane things, including this one.
Hmm.
So depending on who you ask, January 3rd we were supposed to stop, or the first week. So I think we're
Mm.
still safe. Since it's what, the 8th right now, I think we're good. I think we can still say it, but beyond this week, it might be a little bit of a little late to do it. So
Right. After this week, no more Happy New Year.
no
It's
more.
just we're just happy. No more New Year. It's just happy.
And if you go to stores, it's Happy Valentine's Day, apparently. So
Right.
I noticed that like the day after Christmas, I think that everything had turned to hearts and red and things like that.
Seriously. It's like so early. It's like kind of impressive how quickly they get that going.
Yeah. Yeah. So people in the chat are talking about their Christmas trees. We had that same conversation, you guys, before everybody
I
got.
know.
So
I admittedly have not taken down my tree yet. While yeah, mine is still up, but apparently Megan, you took yours down like the day after.
really 27th. So we put it up early though. My kids wanted it really early in November, so I felt like by the 27th I was done. Uh,
Hmm.
so we are back to clean house, thankfully.
I gotta have to do it this weekend. I feel like once we stop saying Happy New Year, I think we also have to put down the
There
tree.
you go.
Um
There you
and
go.
like spiritually transition to the new year. All right. Well, everybody is streaming in and letting us know where they're listening from. If you've tuned into any of our webinars, please follow the example of everyone else in the chat. We love to hear your thoughts and we love to see an engaged discussion. So drop your thoughts and ask any questions along the way, and we'll try our best to address them. And as a reminder, please switch your chat setting at the bottom of the chat screen from hosts and panelists to everyone so the whole community can join in on the conversation. And if you feel like you're missing anything, don't worry. We will be sending around the on-demand recording when it's available. And if you're a Data Central Report Pro subscriber, the full deck will be posted on Report Pro this week. And afterwards, if you're not a Data Central Report Pro subscriber, please just reach out to us and we'll figure out a way to get you sorted. While Megan and I go over some housekeeping items at the top of the hour, we'd love to know where you're listening from again, and if you have any amazing New Year's resolutions that you would be willing to share. Personally, I'm actually going to try and learn some Spanish in 2026. I feel like
Oh.
it's like a language that's so useful in my everyday life, and I feel like now it's time to do it. Do you have any New Year's resolutions, Megan?
So I don't know if I'd call it a resolution. I like the idea of a word or a focus. So
Hmm.
I'm trying to be more present, both at home and
Hmm.
then I don't know if I should say this publicly, but does anybody else like check email on Zoom calls and things like that? I'm trying to be more present and do one thing at a time. I think all the research tells us that multitasking is really not effective. So that's my goal for the year with.
I think that's really poignant and it's really beautiful. I think that's great. Um, All right. Back to housekeeping for just another second before we start on the content side. I'm gonna guess the fact that you're here watching this webinar means that you've successfully been able to register for a full year of our Simply Smarter webinars. But if for some reason you had some issues accessing the invitation link, please note that our link to register for the webinar changes every year. So please register using the new link so that you can be sorted for the next 11 webinars after this one. And we have another incredible session lined up for you next month on February 12th, just 2 days before Valentine's Day. Perfect for culinary inspiration because it's the return of our annual State of the Menu webinar, where our trendologist Claire Conahan will, as she does every single year, help you discover all of the standout menu items and emerging trends and rising foods and flavors for the year ahead. So this is an amazing webinar that we bring back every single year, and you cannot miss it.
Yeah, so I'm excited for that. Claire does a great job, and that's always a favorite. The other thing we want to let you all know about is the Data Central Sales Leadership Awards. This is a new program that we've introduced for you all, our customers, to honor sales leaders or sales colleagues within your organization who have used our data to drive impact. So whether that is the sales strategy, whether that's a customer outcome or sale, or something along the lines of innovation. So the nomination period has been open since before Christmas, but is open until January 16th. We've already gotten some really great submissions, but there's still time. So please, please, please recognize your colleagues and the great work that they do by going to datacentral.com/sales dash leaders to submit your nominations. And then also, if you go to the next slide, there is no rest for the Data Central team coming out of the new year. We are going to be out and about in the market. And if any of you are at these events as well, please come say hello, track us down, tell us some of the things that you're working on. We will be everywhere from San Diego for Winter Fancy Fair to overseas for events in Paris and London. And I know you and I are attuned to the calendar for the rest of the year. February and March are going to be busy as well. So we look forward to seeing some of you out IRL, as they say, in real life. So please say hello, and we'll see you there.
Absolutely. So let's get started by recapping 2025. I just saw a message come in from the chat from Philippe that says that their word of the year is gratitude.
Mm.
And I think it's a really interesting coincidence because the way that I'd love to start this webinar today is to review what all of the major dictionary organizations designate as their word of the year, a single word to sort of synthesize and capture all of the nuances of any given year. These are always meant to be like a time capsule, right? They're reflecting the trends and the events that really defined a year. But I feel like this year the words that were selected by all three of these organizations are somewhat chaotic because Merriam-Webster have chosen slop as their 2025 word of the year, and they define slop as like digital content that is low quality and usually produced by AI. Oxford Dictionary chose rage bait, which is defined as online content deliberately designed to elicit anger or outrage in order to increase traffic or engagement. And like many people have pointed out in the chat, dictionary.com went with 6-7, which should be a familiar sight to you if you are a parent of a school-age child. Yeah, Megan, have you encountered 6-7 in your personal life?
I have. I could do the whole thing here and show it to my kids later and embarrass them. I have a 12 and a 15-year-old. 6-7, nobody knows what it means. It doesn't really mean anything. But we've seen it at home and at school. We've seen it on TV. But it is dead, I hear now, thankfully. I think I heard that parents killed it. It was a Halloween costume for a lot of parents, and the quickest way to kill something is to have somebody over 30 start doing it. Um, and so we haven't heard it too much. I know you and I were talking about, is there something else like 41 or something like that? But at least in Arizona, I can see in the chat people are saying it's still alive and well, but it's not. It's
Right, I was gonna say the same thing. Yeah, I feel like I still see it pop around every now and then.
yeah.
And yeah, Jackie in the chat is absolutely right. Many people have conducted a lot of wormhole digging to figure out what this word actually means. And really it's kind of meaningless. It could be a song lyric, it could mean a sense of ambivalence, it could be a lack of resolution, whatever it means. In the words of dictionary.com editors, perhaps the most defining feature of 6-7, and the reason why they chose it, is that it's kind of impossible to define. It kind of captures the brain rot generation, so to speak. It's meaningless, it's ubiquitous, it's nonsensical. And if that is the case, I feel like that does not speak very well into what 2025 is. And all that is to say, I think many of us can agree that 2025 was a complicated and tumultuous year for many people. We recently conducted a survey with our usual panel of consumers to figure out how they felt about all of the events of the year. And 64 of consumers agree that the world felt more unstable in 2025 than in previous years. For most of our data points, we usually try to tease out different demographic differences and see if different generations or people from different backgrounds sort of interpret something differently. But this is one of the very rare occasions, if you can see on the chart on the right, that all generations are in agreement with this. There are no significant differences between any generation. So no matter how old you are, no matter where you come from, no matter what experiences you had, there's a sense among two-thirds of consumers that 2025 was kind of an unstable year. And all this is to say, though, for the majority of 2025, a lot of consumers were having to reckon with the instability of it all and trying to create a semblance of stability in their own personal lives. We ask consumers, out of all of these different aspects of their personal lives, from nutrition and diet, family and relationships, hobby and free time, and mental health and well-being, all of these different factors that inform how you live, whether any of these factors have improved, remained unchanged, and worsened. We had the same data presented at last year's year-end review webinar, and I think this year's results are actually slightly more positive than what it was at the end of 2024. Over a third of consumers felt like their nutrition and diet has really improved. A third of consumers say that their family and relationships have improved. Their physical health and fitness have been able to tangibly improve. And perhaps the one area where the gap between improvement and worsening is the smallest is personal finances, which I think we can all agree have been kind of a sore spot or a salient area for many, many consumers. So it's interesting that we can see that despite the instability of the year, despite the 6-7 brain rot of it all, many people have tried their best to remain in control of their lives. We then asked consumers, and we wanted to examine how consumers led their daily lives throughout 2025 and whether or not their daily habits and routines have changed. So we presented our consumers with a long list of habits and activities, from self-care activities and personal errands to behaviors and occasions related to food and dining. And then for each of these habits, again, we asked consumers if they perform these things more often, less often, or just about the same in 2025 as they did in 2024. And while a large majority of consumers say they stuck to familiar routines and didn't change how often they did these things, many actively shifted their personal habits. And in front of you is a sorted list of the top 10 activities and behaviors consumers said they did more of in 2025. To me, the list of activities here tells two different stories, right? The first is that a notable share of consumers actively worked to improve their lifestyles. Nearly a third of consumers, especially Gen Z and millennials, say they drank more water in 2025, and over a quarter exercised or played sports more often. 26% say they ate more healthy foods, and 24% increased their use of vitamins and supplements to support their overall nutrition. And a similar share also were more responsible and spent more time doing household chores and home maintenance. But on the other hand, what I'm also noticing is that a lot of these behaviors are solitary. People spent more time at home. People spent more time alone. They're watching more TV. They're scrolling through more social media. They're cooking and making coffee at home more often, which can be a good thing for their budgets. But from a food service standpoint, this may not be such an amazing signal. And on the flip side, here's a list of the top 10 activities that people say that they did less often in 2025. And these are also admittedly not great when viewed through the lens of food service, because a lot of these activities are communal and they're out of the home. A notable share of consumers say that throughout 2025, they ate out less often, they bought coffee away from home less often, they'd ordered food off-premise, for off-premise consumption more often, whether that's delivery or pickup. And I do want to provide a caveat still that a majority of these consumers did not adjust how often they did these things. The reason why these numbers are like 22%, 19%, 80%, 18% is that around 50% still said that that these habits have stayed the same. But what this list is designed for is to provide a pulse check in how consumers dealt with the year. And I think behaviors away from home decreasing, I think falls in line with a lot of how the industry felt about traffic in 2025.
Yeah, I was gonna
Megan, do you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say the same thing what you did, right? Is I think this goes to what we've seen in terms of traffic trends and the decline. And we're almost kind of coming back to some of those COVID behaviors, right? Where we were
Hmm.
scrolling and at home and streaming and things like that. So it's really important for us to understand ways that we can attract consumers out of their homes. And certainly we're primed in the restaurant space to be able to do that.
Hmm. Totally. I wanted to take a minute to transition a bit away from personal lifestyle and habits, though, to factor in broader social factors that affected how people lived their lives in 2025. We have this data point in all of our monthly economic trackers. And at the end of 2025, still, nearly two-thirds of consumers say that inflation and the rising cost of living was a significant concern. And this figure has remained pretty consistent throughout the year. Other financial worries also ranked really high, including the fears of a potential recession, which stood at around 47%. And beyond economics, consumers were also living with a bunch of other social forces affecting how they conducted their day-to-day life, how they viewed the world around them, and how they felt like the society in which they live has been maintained, right? So people were very worried about healthcare and political instability and climate change and all of these different factors that, are extant to their lives, but has a really strong hand in guiding the world in which they live. We then presented some consumers with this list of broad social issues and asked if they thought these issues have improved, stayed the same, or worsened over the past year. And what you see in front of you now is a ranked list of the top 10 issues consumers felt have worsened the most in 2025. And I'm sure Megan and I can spend almost forever dissecting how each and every one of these things have impacted consumer behavior. But I think that the most important thing to note here is that despite the presence of what do we consider, I guess, more controversial or more contentious issues like politics and international conflicts and tariffs and trade policies that seemingly dominated headlines all throughout 2025, inflation and the rising cost of living continues to be the most salient thing for consumers and stands at the top of the list as the number one issue that they felt have gotten worse throughout 2025. And I think this is also really striking when you juxtapose this data and their consumer assessment with the fact that according to most major macroeconomic indicators, the national inflation rate has actually remained pretty stable throughout 2025 and was under 4% all year. So even though I think it seems like from macroeconomic indicators that the US government has been able to really control the inflation situation, clearly that effort is not translating to how consumers are living their daily lives, and they are feeling pinched at every corner. So this is a good point, I think, for me to pass the baton over to Megan, who will provide you with even more economic context. But before I do that, I do want to address a question from the chat, whether or not this data is U.S. centric. And yes, all of this data that you're seeing here has been collected with U.S. consumers only. Over to you, Megan.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I mean, we understand that there's some kind of feelings among the consumer, and consumer sentiment is down. A lot of that does have to do with the economy. And if we go to the next slide, we really get a feel for, I think that point that you mentioned, even though inflation has stabilized on paper and according to economists, that's not necessarily the feeling among consumers. They feel like everything is getting more expensive. And so we ask consumers about their personal finances, about how they're feeling in their outlook. And you can see here, three-quarters of consumers tell us they're either just getting by or they're falling behind financially. And again, this is an area that's going to have an impact for those of us in the restaurant space that rely on disposable income, and consumers to drive traffic. You can see here about half of consumers feel like their expenses have increased in the past 6 months. So again, this is kind of counter to what we've seen coming out from economists in terms of the fact that prices have stabilized a bit. And it's created this negative outlook. And we've talked a lot about this at Data Central. We've thrown around the term vibe session, where even though we're not in a recession, consumers kind of feel like it. And I think they just in general feel like they've been struggling a bit. And we have seen significant price increases over the past few years. So if you go to the next slide for me, I think one of the key things that we're seeing and that we're going to dig in a little bit here is the growing disparity between consumers in a higher income bracket and those in a lower income bracket. And they have just different sentiments and different feelings about it. So when we dig into this data, specifically based on income level, you can see this big jump and big gap here. When we ask and dig into that, money is tight and I'm falling behind. 16% of overall consumers, but 28% in that lower income bracket feel that. That's a 25-point spread between those in the higher income. And then those that feel like they're doing okay and they're getting ahead definitely are more in that higher income bracket. And so somebody mentioned it in the chat. If we go to that next slide, it is indeed what we're calling and what others are calling the K-shaped economy. And basically what this is this growing gap and disparity between those in top earner brackets and those in the lower ones. And we feel this in the restaurant space. I think our latest data shows that almost 60% of restaurant spending is being driven by consumers that make over $100,000 per year. And so we have this big gap between those at the top and those in the lower bracket. And that's going to have an impact on spend and for those of us in the space. And so if you go to the next slide, we dig in a little bit further to this data based on income level. And so depending on who you talk to, they have a different answer to these questions, right? My income is covering all of my expenses. Almost 80% of those in the high income bracket say yes, whereas almost half in that lower income bracket say no. So if they don't feel like they're covering all of their expenses, they're not going to have an opportunity to spend more money by going out to eat. If we move on, we'll also see this when we look at potential price increases and whether we can afford to absorb more price increases or if we feel like we're already pushed to the brink. So again, 2/3 of lower income consumers just feel like, hey, this needs to be the top. I can't push anymore. Compared to the high income, certainly high income earners don't want to see prices going up, but they can kind of address it and deal with it a little bit better if it happens. So this is what we're feeling. You can see overall that all of this has an impact on the way folks are spending money and how they choose to spend their money. So almost 3/4 of consumers say that all of this is making them be more selective about where they spend, especially on food. And if we go back to that idea of the changes that consumers made that we shared early on, right? We're doing more at home, we're making coffee at home, we're eating more at home. We may not be ordering off premise or delivery as often. So we're going to pivot now, I believe, into the operator perspective. Now that we know the consumer sentiment, kind of this meh, if you will, in terms of how we're feeling, we're going to dig into the operator side and get their perspective as well. So the first data point that we're going to look at here, I think is just really interesting. We ask consumers kind of about operations in general, back of the house, kind of general day-to-day tactics, and whether it improved or worsened in 2025. One of the things I think is really telling about this data is there's a lot of areas that the operator can control that they feel like improved. So service levels, menu innovation, menu introductions, relationships with their suppliers, all green, right? They can control that. They felt like it improved. The biggest area that we're seeing, though, which is similar and echoing what we saw in consumers, is cost. So cost of ingredients and supplies. Overwhelmingly, operators are telling us that that area worsened for them year over year. And if we dig into the next slide, we can see that operators also have a similar view of the economy compared to consumers. Not too surprising. Operators are consumers as well, but they're feeling it both in their spend and then also in their businesses. So over half of operators told us that they felt like the economy worsened in 2025. And that 12%, as you can see here, that's actually year over year change. So 12% more operators told us that they felt like the economy had worsened in 2025 compared to the year prior. So definitely feeling the pinch across the board. And as you'll see in our next slide, there's two areas that we're really fighting from an operator standpoint in terms of increased cost. We've been fighting labor for many years. This is not a new story in terms of labor cost increases and how tough it is to find labor. So almost 75% of our operators felt that, but almost 90% here you can see are struggling with the food costs. So much so that as you see on the next slide, food costs are now kind of the top economic concern among operators. Rising prices for food and ingredients, 70% indicated that that is their biggest and most impactful economic factor right now, which is probably not too surprising as we look at the data in terms of what is getting more expensive. So as we move on to the next slide, we see things like beef, right? We've heard a lot about beef prices being high. But basically, all across the board, operators tell us that things are more expensive and that they're dealing with this. Seafood, fresh fruits, prepared entrees, prepared appetizers, basically every part of the menu, they feel like they are getting squeezed a bit. And this is having that trickle down effect. Operators feel increased costs. We're trying to pass that on to consumers. But as you can see in the next slide, kind of the approaches that we're taking in order to address that. Lee, if you don't mind changing for me.
Oh yeah, sorry. I was hoping to
Oh, did
interject
you
for
want to chime
just
in?
a
I'm
second.
sorry.
All
Yeah.
good. Yeah, thank you. I saw a comment come in from the chat of Andrea saying that this is pretty much all proteins, and I think
Mhm.
the protein being the most salient areas for cost increases is no surprising. A nuance that I want to highlight here that we're not presenting because it would make the chart too complicated is that the numbers you see here is actually a combination of operators saying that these costs have increased slightly and significantly. And for a
Okay.
lot of these different metrics, the overall percentage is high, but the share between slightly and significantly is very different. But beef, pretty much most of that 92% are saying that beef prices have increased significantly. So there's a lot of nuances in whether or not these costs have increased significantly or just a little bit, and that also impacts whether or not operators feel like they can, absorb the cost or if they have to pass on an ingredient entirely. Um, Back to the protein issue a little bit, though, you'll notice there is one major source of protein that is not on this top 10 list, and it is pork. Pork, I believe, was still rated by around 70% of operators as having increased in prices over the year, but the majority of those are slight increases. So this is the one area that operators have not felt as pinched about. But obviously, menuing pork, the affordable red meat, like Carl says, presents different challenges to your operation, right? Whether or not you're accommodating dietary restrictions or if you're trying to accommodate specific consumers. So it's definitely a different ballgame. But all that is to say, there's a lot of nuances in this level of ingredient and product inflation that affects how well operators are able to adapt.
And that protein piece, I mean, we see that as such a popular trend right now, and the interest in protein, right? And places like Chipotle and other folks that are really leaning into that. So quite interesting when we're seeing the prices and feeling that price increase as well.
Totally. One last question to address before we move on. Sabrina, we split out shellfish and bivalves into a separate seafood category because we wanted to isolate fish like tuna, like salmon, like whitefish into its own category. So that's why it's being presented that way. All right, moving on.
Thank you, Wee. Okay, so despite this, right, which feels a little bit of doom and gloom, we do see a good confidence level, I would say, from operators in terms of how they're going into 2026 and what they're expecting. So I actually think this is great, whether we're an optimistic bunch or what. Operators tend to try to start the year off with a rosy view. Maybe we're trying to manifest this. But you can see here over 70% of operators feel somewhat or even extremely confident going into the year. If we move on to the next slide, we can take a look at kind of the approaches that operators are going to take in order to be profitable in 2026. We and I had a really great conversation about this heading into this webinar. You can see here that there is a goal really to attract new customers or win back lapsed guests. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing a lot of loyalty discussions. But really, what we're seeing between this slide and then also on the next slide is a focus on traffic. And how do we increase daily transactions and get people back in the door more often? I think we could all agree that we've gone really far with check, and we may have gone as far as we can, at least right now. And so, really, we're seeing the industry focus on transactions. I know we are going to talk later about little treat culture and snacking and things like that. But certainly getting more folks back through the door more often is an area that we are seeing operators focus on. And I think with that,
Totally.
I'm going to hand it back off to you if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you so much, Megan. One last thing about these insights before we move forward. The 56-44% split that you see here, we conducted the same survey last year, and that actually used to be 49% attract new guests and 51% satisfy and retain current customers. So the needle has really moved towards the strategy of really trying to get as many people through the door as possible. So that strategy is a lot more salient for operators going into 26 than ever before. So we've just presented a lot of information for you all, and in order for us to sort of pause here and get a little pulse check, I wanted to summarize sort of the highlights of everything that we presented. We had operators' perspective, consumer perspective, economic perspective, right? But to summarize how 2025 felt by the numbers, Despite a turbulent 2025, many consumers really focus on different areas that they could control in their personal lives, like health and fitness and routines and diet or personal relationships. But for factors that were beyond their control, like inflation and healthcare and political instability, these factors are really weighing in on their brains as they're moving towards, their next stage of their life, as they're moving through everyday life. And so it's a dual effect happening with the consumer mindset. And in particular, the economy has been a really sore spot for many consumers who feel like their expenses have increased, who feel like they're not moving ahead financially, who felt like they can't take any more price increases and are stuck in just trying to persist and live on paycheck to paycheck or like living through their everyday lives and not making meaningful gains. And all of these have a cumulative effect on how selective they are about where they spend their money, especially when it comes to food and dining. And then from the operator's perspective, as Megan just covered, operators were largely able to endure 2025's challenges, but rising costs really squeezed their margins, making traffic growth more critical than increasing average check. So this is where we stand. And for the rest of our time here, I think it would be really great for us to move forward with 2026 because I think we presented some pretty doom and gloom and not positive information so far. And even though it provides a really nuanced and accurate perspective into how consumers and operators are dealing with as they're moving into this new year, I think it's more important for our audience to figure out we can really do about all of this stuff, right? Like, yes, consumers are stressed. Yes, they're strapped for money. How can we still engage with them and get them out of the door and get them into your food service businesses and really contribute and build a food service ecosystem? And we were just talking just now about how strangely optimistic operators are going into 2026. And I just wanted to counteract that point with this slide because I think consumers are also in a similar boat. Because despite all of the challenges that they face in their everyday lives, they're not pessimistic across the board. Far from it. Nearly 60% say that they feel optimistic about the quality of their lives heading into 2026, and nearly half believe that their overall quality of life will improve in 2026. I think it's a realistic and nuanced sense of optimism. It's kind of an understanding that even though things may not be perfect in every aspect of your life, there is still things to look forward to. And I think food plays a really central role in building that optimism and making consumers happy and eliminating at moments in their lives where they feel stress. Um, and with optimism and tension living side by side, what does the 2026 consumer really want? There are many ways for us to answer that, I'm sure, but I think one of the clearest and most compelling frameworks that I've been able to find is really in a single word, which is max. In 2026, consumers aren't always seeking more, but they are seeking to maximize benefits from every decision that they make. And I think we can break this mentality down into three powerful need states, maximizing value, maximizing control, and maximizing indulgence. And for the rest of our time today, I'd love to shed some light into what each of these entail. So let's talk first about value. Throughout 2025, value emerged as one of the strongest and most persistent consumer needs because people are more value conscious than ever and increasingly resistant to further price increases, like we covered earlier on. In our quarterly dining decision tracker, value ranks as the second most important factor when choosing where to eat away from home, which is second only to taste. And that has been pretty much consistent all throughout 2025. And operators too are responding in kind because if you are currently a food service operator, I can guarantee that it's almost impossible for you to escape the value conversation, right? In the same survey that we conducted with operators in November, we asked operators to indicate which menu categories they plan on focusing their level of culinary innovation on in 2026. And although operator priorities vary greatly across segments and across need states, you can see here that value menu items and promotions is the second most likely category for operators to focus their menu development efforts on, just behind core menu items. So operators understand intimately that consumers are seeking out value and they're trying their best to respond in kind. But value is multidimensional, and not all consumers define it in the same way. In our recent value equation report, we found that nearly two-thirds consumers sort of gravitate towards the Goldilocks definition of value, right? We want a good deal, but we don't want to sacrifice quality or experience. And an additional 20% want the best possible food and experience, regardless of price. Only 15% of consumers actually define value as finding the cheapest possible option. And so when we say that value is more than just price, this is really what we mean. Value is no longer just a price tag, but that being said, I think lower prices overall cannot be ignored, right? We ask consumers what would motivate them to dine out more in person or order more off-premise, so than they already do. And lower prices overall and more value meal options can certainly motivate them to move to order out more often or dine out more often. And these are short-term traffic drivers that are not negligible, right? But I think overall, you still want to build a laser focus and more holistic value strategy among all of your offerings instead of relying exclusively on lower prices and value meals. Megan and I had a great conversation about craveability, right? And what that and how that can really contribute to the value equation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important for us all to recognize that this is an extremely difficult value proposition, right? Or
Hmm.
complicated value proposition that we're all facing right now, or equation with consumers, where they want value, but it doesn't just mean price. And in some ways, a cheaper price may be counterproductive for them, right? And so that's where we've really dug into our data. As many of you know, Data Central tracks every single new item and LTO that's introduced by the top chains. And we track it and survey consumers based on six different metrics, including value, purchase intent, craveability. And craveability is kind of that idea of, I can't get this at home. I want to go out to eat. And that's why I'm kind of leaving my home and seeking this. And so this was really interesting when we dug into some areas that exceeded or excelled in value, excuse me, but also really hit on that craveability factor. So things like a sundae, for example, from Burger King, the skillet from Cracker Barrel, which is really kind of digging into that kind of the value and what I can get for my money, which is this great skillet that includes shrimp and corn and things like that. And then same even with this Jack's Family Restaurant item where you've got the six strips of bacon. So they're really trying to promote kind of the craveability of bacon and the amount that you're getting at that price point. Notice that none of these are a dollar either, right? We've kind of moved beyond the dollar menu. It's extremely hard to do anything for a dollar nowadays. And so I think this is really interesting. Certainly items that are craveable. I think we have another slide too. We have some other items as well. Yeah. The Arby's prime rib steak nuggets, I think was a really great introduction. It also scored really well in terms of that craveability. That's kind of the uniqueness score that we have there. Also hits on the protein trend that we've seen. These fried cheesecake bites, these are things like you're not going to make at home and you're not going to be able to replicate at home. And again, that's something that drives consumers out of their homes. And then this pickle sandwich, I just have to call attention to it because it's kind of an interesting approach to a trend that we saw. We saw a lot of introductions with pickles. We saw some that were really crazy, like pickle slushes. I know there's a pickle Pepsi going around driving
There's a pickle
social.
lemonade also that like scored pretty
Oh,
well on lunches and ratings.
Oh, a pickle lemonade. That's new to me. But this is kind of that incremental innovation that Data Central talks about, which is the fried chicken sandwich that everybody knows and loves. And then with that pickle glaze, and a great price point at $4.99 from Popeyes. So again, like they're good price points. They're not base bottom cheap price points. But they're good items as well, and they tap into other trends, and they pull into that craveability factor. So really interesting. Also, kind of this complex approach that we're seeing to the value equation.
Right. And I think overall, I guess the point we're trying to make here is that value will look differently from consumer to consumer, but also will look differently from brand to brand. And I think understanding the kind of value that your brand can offer to consumers and really homing in on what really makes your brand valuable. Is it really unique items that you can't create anywhere or find anywhere? Is it adapting to trends and making sure that consumers are getting the latest and greatest that are captivating their senses? Or is it offering really interesting portion sizes for the quantity of the food and the price that they're getting? Value will look differently, and really determining strategically what value looks like for your operation will really help you meet these value conscious consumers halfway in 2026. So moving on from value, I wanted to touch on the second pillar of this Max framework, which is control. And I think this encapsulates a lot of different things, and it feels a little esoteric, it feels a little nebulous. But really, I think when so many elements of people's daily lives and the broader world are unpredictable and constantly changing, we're seeing consumers seek out areas where they can assert control over their lives and have more guarantees, or as many guarantees as possible. We see this heightened desire for control show up across many different domains of life, but I think a slide that really encapsulates this is this slide that we have every year, which is consumers' 2026 New Year's resolutions. You notice that the top four New Year's resolutions here are all really concrete behaviors, right? People are approaching the start of a new year with the mentality and the desire to exercise more, to concretely save more money, to eat healthier, to improve their physical health. Being happier, which is a more nebulous and more emotional feeling, is only fifth on this list. So consumers are already going to naturally want to create structures for themselves in a world that feels like they're changing. The January salad LTOs or the increased gym memberships absolutely is happening here too. And I think with that, I think health and wellness is going to be the area in which consumers will want to exert as much control as possible. Um, the rise in popularity of things like GLP-1 medications, as well as the various sub-elements of the Make America Healthy movement, things like seed oils and ultra-processed foods and artificial dyes and the backlash against all of these items. I think they are perfect examples of how consumers today are trying to assert as much control over their diet as possible, right? And I find this stat really interesting, and I try to show it to as many people as I can. But in the 2025 survey that we conducted, nearly 60% of consumers overall agree with the sentiment that only I and me alone can determine what foods are best for me and my family. And if that's not an example of how people are really trying to grab as much control of their lives as possible, then I don't know what is. Wellness in 2025 and going on to 2026 will still be really holistic, but I think the biggest health trends of the moment are pointing to a health era that is no longer just about moderation. They're about maximizing the intake of things that people consider good, like protein, like water or fiber, and eliminating things that make you feel unsafe, which for some could be seed oils, artificial ingredients, sugar, calories, you name it. Maximizing the good, minimalizing the bad. And so it is really as much about health as it is about self-governance. And I think food service has a really important role to play when people are really trying to exert as much control over their diet as possible. And already we're seeing them respond in kind. Both of these examples that you see here, the left side is mindful meals from Lazy Dog Restaurants, which is a pretty big casual dining chain. And on the right is the new Sweet Green Function menu. It's a collaboration with a health technology company that provides, direct-to-consumer lab testing and advanced imaging. These are both really concerted efforts to really hone in to functional health in terms of food service offerings. And both of these just came out last week. So already operators and big brands are hitting the year strong by really tapping into consumers' desire to have as much control over their health and wellness as possible. But beyond health and wellness, control also naturally shows up in other ways. In particular, I think in 2026, consumers will demand even more ways to customize and control their orders away from home. We see here that 71% of consumers say that the ability to personalize and customize their food orders is more important nowadays, and 59% agree that if a restaurant near them offered more flexible portion size options, they would be more likely to visit that restaurant, right? Portion control is especially important for the share of consumers who are currently utilizing GLP-1 medications, and that share is only increasing by the day. And we can already see top chains like Shake Shack and Chipotle really are the next in line to meet these portion conscious consumers in the middle. Just last month, both Shake Shack and Chipotle released a number of health conscious menu items from high protein items and gluten-free items to specifically designated GLP-1 friendly dishes. So these GLP-1 friendly menu additions are moving from just retail and designed food and diet packages into food service itself. Portion control is also showing up not just in limited service restaurants, but also in full service. In December, Olive Garden announced that in 2026 they will be launching a lighter portions menu section across all of their restaurants, which are smaller and cheaper versions of their fan favorite dishes like chicken parmesan or fettuccine alfredo. So this is where value and control really go hand in hand. And also in September, P.F. Chang's unveiled a new menu that includes two portion sizes for entrees at different price points, traditional or medium, which is a smaller portion at again a lower price. So really tapping into the portion element is really helping customers feel like they have more flexibility with what they can get away from home.
So this is so interesting to
Hmm.
Kiwi, especially if you remember some places that were dinged because people felt like their portion sizes had changed, right? But here we have like full transparency and like addressing a need. So we're going to offer you this option and charge a little less. I'm not sure about the Shake Shack burger wrapped in
And
lettuce.
lettuce,
If that
yeah.
really qualifies as GLP friendly, but hey, it's worth a try. Uh,
I think that one they were trying to advertise as being high protein.
ah, the
But they were
double
also
wrapped
having
with the lettuce.
right, yeah. But I think there's a comment in the chat about like Olive Garden doing this lighter meal section to ditch unlimited breadsticks, and I don't think unlimited breadsticks are going away. I think it's having more options for different types of eaters, and I think the assumption that your customer base is really your one main thing, I think that has gone away. I think many brands are going to try and do as much as they can to accommodate as many types of eaters as possible to capture as many dollars as possible, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then finally, we have the third pillar of this whole equation, which is indulgence. And I'm also seeing a lot of interesting discussion in the chat about how control and health and wellness and indulgence can really stand side by side. But I think as someone with the lofty title of trendologist, there's something that I've always believed in is that where there is one trend, there is always a counter trend. It's kind of like the Newton's law of motion when it comes to trends, right? When one need arise, there's going to be a different set of consumers who are going to want the opposite thing, or sometimes they're going to play out side by side. And one of the ways in which indulgence shows up really well in 2026 is little treat culture or the continuation of it. Because we've talked about little treat culture a lot, and it's not going away at all. I think in a world where you feel like you need to cost cut and self-monitor all the time, I think you need the emotional counterweight to make your life feel better and more joyful in all of the little moments where you need it, right? And we can see here that little tree culture really captures the interplay between food and emotions because 50% of consumers say that they typically have a snack when they're feeling down or need a pick-me-up, and this is much higher than other traditional forms of self-care like putting on a face mask or watching your favorite show or scrolling through social media. Having a snack is one of the most popular ways for consumers to deal with emotional moments where they're not feeling so great. And little street culture also plays into snacking culture because more and more consumers are treating snacking not just as the extra, but in replacement of traditional meals as well. So the traditional breakfast, lunch, and dinner, 3 meals a day eating occasion is no longer as reliable as before because consumers are on the move. They're treating their diet a little differently. They're eating more often in smaller portions. They're utilizing snacking to fulfill different pockets of needs. Um, and I think two really interesting examples that kind of capture the spirit of little treat culture, and not as overtly as like, the $5 latte or the donut, is this barista cup from Starbucks, which I think if you saw the headlines at all in November, you know that Starbucks released this teddy bear shaped cold cup, the barista, and it sold out in minutes upon being released, and I think subsequently got listed on eBay for up to like $1,000 before it came back to the market, right? But
Yep.
but while the cup itself isn't an actual treat, and it was sold for like $30 per cup, it really tapped into the joy and whimsy of the overall experience of getting an indulgent beverage away from home, right? And then I bring up the Arby's steak nuggets again. I know we covered it in an earlier slide, but the steak nuggets came out and gave the brand a lot of visibility, regardless of whether or not you think this is a successful menu launch, regardless of how you think it tasted. I think the fact that they're leaning into this menu item and this strategy is really an acknowledgement that no matter what kind of brand you are, whether you're a beverage brand or Arby's, a sandwich burger, meat shop, like there are ways to incorporate snackability and treatability into your menu items. So that's really kind of the ethos, right? Um, and I think the most visible and efficient path to provide indulgence and tap into that little treat culture is through beverages, especially non-alcoholic beverages, which consumers in 2025 truly could not get enough of. And we suspect it won't be any different in 2026 either. According to a recent survey we conducted for our Elevate community, 68% of consumers say that they have a beverage as an indulgent treat weekly or more often. And 63% say that they enjoy beverages specifically as a healthy snack at least once a week. So beverages fulfill all of these different need states and can really get consumers really excited about getting stuff away from home. And when we ask consumers what kind of trending beverages they'd be interested in trying out away from home, you can see here that consumer interest in beverages is high and varied. So if there's ever a time for your brand to experiment and expand your beverage offerings to captivate consumers, this is really the time to do it. And I want to showcase two really interesting examples here that really get at the spirit of the new craze around beverage and the indulgence of beverages. Taco Bell's Mountain Dew Baja Midnight, which is a tropical fruit flavored Baja Blast with added passion fruit flavor, and this time it's purple instead of the usual teal, received an 85 composite score on our launches and ratings platform, and its frozen version received an even higher composite score of 96. So consumers saw this and thought it was really unique and also thought it was great value. And on the right, you also see Blank Street Coffee, which is a New York-based coffee chain, introduced a really viral banana bread matcha latte, which blends matcha with banana, cinnamon, nutmeg, and oat milk. So really taking an established dessert concept and translating it into a drink and combining it with matcha, which continues to trend year over year. So really, there's so many different pathways to experiment with beverages and provide that indulgence that consumers really want. And then finally, I wanted to touch on indulgence, not just on a flavor and food perspective, but also an experiential moment. Because I think indulgence, many consumers, especially Gen Z and millennials, see indulgence as also a unique and sensory and emotionally resonant dining experience. We're seeing trends pop up throughout the past couple of years of, nostalgia and whimsy and experiential dining. And these generations are going to seek experiences that feel memorable and also it's social media worthy. So food isn't the only indulgent moment. The moment itself can also be indulgent. And here are just a few prominent examples that I want to showcase to sort of like wrap up our time here. In our 2026 report, 2026 trends report, I apologize. One interesting nugget that we didn't get to cover in last month's webinar is the prediction that hibachi is on the rise in the US. And hibachi refers to both the portable Japanese charcoal grill, but also the larger griddle cooktop used in places like Benihana, which I think is the most visible and popular example, right? But it's food cooked in a communal manner. Communal style cooking is really back as consumers post-pandemic went back into group dining, and it has continued to trend because it is a really great way for people to share a great occasion and order lots of different things and split a really large and indulgent meal among many different people. And a lot of the social, communal, and experimental appeal behind hibachi can also be noticed in the proliferation of things like hot pot and Korean barbecue, as Alicia mentioned in the chat. Um, these are cooking formats that invite the audience to participate in their own dining occasion, right? So K-pop comes to mind always as the most prominent industry example, but there are plenty more emerging chains specializing in this kind of cook it yourself experiential dining, taking up that market share. So on the left, you have Happy Lamb Hot Pot, which is a 25 unit hot pot chain based out of California, and on the right, it's Gen Korean Barbecue House, which currently has 45 units, and I have a pretty good feeling that they might make it into our Data Central 500 report this year. So, communal dining, experiential dining, are really taking up a lot of consumer attention right now. A different type of experiential dining that is also featured in the 2026 Trends Report is the momentum building around tea as operators across the country are reinventing happy hour to look more like whimsical afternoon tea experiences and catering to your alcohol-conscious consumers, creating elaborate spreads and tablescapes that spark surprise and delight, while also being really pretty for social media. On the left, you see the Victorian teacup espresso martini from Oscar Wilde, which is an eclectic Victorian style bar in Manhattan, but it's an alcoholic beverage that's fashioned in the style of a tea beverage. It looks almost identical to a cup of English breakfast tea, right? And then on the right, you see Fora, which is a restaurant in Chicago, and they're one of the many operators today launching new afternoon tea experiences to replace happy hour, complete with tea time favorites like cucumber sandwiches and scones and desserts, alongside both a selection of tea and alcoholic beverages should you seek it out. So, taking a need state and an occasion that has kind of been on the decline and reinventing it to be more inclusive of different eaters and provide a new sense of whimsy is also a way to introduce a new experience to the overall equation. A few more things to really wrap up experiences. A dining experience is not always just about the food, and a trend that I've been personally keeping tabs on is the rise of Japanese style listening bars, especially across major dining metros like Los Angeles and San Francisco and New York. And these listening bars are somewhere between a bar, a gallery, and a nightclub, and they are focused on, music appreciation with high fidelity sound systems and often a curated vinyl collections, but patrons can also enjoy really high quality food and beverages. And if you notice, those with a discerning eye in the audience would know that the man on the right is Chef Sean Brock, who is a James Beard Award winning chef that you might have seen on Chef's Table. And he opened a new Japanese style listening bar, and he's seen here spinning tracks at his own restaurant in Los Angeles. And I'm not presenting this to say that everybody should open a listening bar here, but all to say that the experiential moments like the music selection of your restaurant can also be used as an opportunity to invite eaters to engage more thoughtfully with your space. And then finally, when I think of experience for dining, the first thing that comes to mind is always classic tableside service, which has, I think, returned in a really major way. Operators across the country are creating new and interesting ways to put on a show to impress diners who are always looking for new experiences and new ways to be impressed. But tableside service in 2026 is not just about duck a la presse or Caesar salads or giant pasta and Parmesan wheels anymore. And here are two really interesting examples I want to showcase here. On the left is Ada, which is a restaurant in New York offering a butter chicken experience. It's $42 per person. It has to be pre-ordered, and everybody at the table has to participate. And you choose how your chicken is smoked in a silver drum that sits on your table, which house-churned butter goes into the sauce, and the chef and owner of the restaurant himself will come over to give you sniffs of apple and cherry blossom wood chips and to also banter with you while he's preparing your butter chicken for around half an hour. On the right, you see Mediterranean restaurant Alhambra in DC offering a Turkish tiramisu experience, which comes deconstructed. So a server will present a tray of ladyfingers, then they'll douse them with espresso and spoon a layer of Turkish coffee-infused cream and dust it with cocoa powder right at the table. So really different ways to reinterpret classic dishes to make it more fun and engaging for the diner. So as we look to 2026, the consumer mindset is really clear. People want to maximize their lives, their dollars, their choices, their emotional experiences in whatever ways possible. And I think the operators who are most poised to succeed will be those that can figure out their own paths to delivering value and control and flexibility and indulgence in ways that feel intuitive and brand authentic. So that's everything we have for you today. On behalf of Megan and myself, thank you all so much for spending the past hour with us and for helping us ring in yet another year of Data Central's Simply Smarter webinars. I think we presented a lot of really unique and diverse insights today. And if you want some assistance helping make sense of all of these different conflicting patterns and factors and consumer mindsets, reach out to your Data Central sales representative and we'll figure out a way to help you strategize and come up with a pathway to success in a year that promises to probably be just as chaotic and turbulent as the last one. Tune in next month to catch our annual State of the Menu webinar. It's a really important one. It's full of incredible menu insights, and we bring it back every single year. But until then, for the last time before I'm not allowed to say it anymore, Happy New Year and have a wonderful rest of your week.